Have you ever felt like the world was asleep and then suddenly everyone woke up? Like in 2011.
Yeah,
It felt like the Arab world just exploded.
it was.
Protests, revolutions,
Mm.
regimes toppled. Today we're diving deep into the heart of the Arab Spring.
Revolutions are fascinating. They always seem so sudden.
Yeah,
But when you look closer, you can see the tensions simmering, the frustrations bubbling under the surface for years, sometimes decades.
exactly. And to really grasp those simmering tensions, we're going to look closely at the stories of people who lived through those crazy times.
Right.
Let's start in Tunisia,
Okay.
often considered the birthplace of the Arab Spring,
Uh-huh.
with a young woman named Dora Agrabi.
So Dora's story is really a window into life under Ben Ali's regime.
Okay.
On the surface, it might have seemed stable, prosperous even,
Right.
but under the surface, it was a whole different reality.
Dora grew up in Tunis. Pretty idyllic life by the sound of it.
Hmm.
Loving family, a jasmine-scented garden, parents who really pushed education.
Sounds lovely.
But even in this picture-perfect setting, there were cracks.
Those cracks were the reality of Ben Ali's Tunisia. Sure, there was economic growth, but it was mainly crony capitalism,
Meaning?
meaning the benefits mostly went to a small group of elites connected to the regime.
Ah.
For most Tunisians, though, life was tough. Economic hardship, political oppression, and that constant feeling of being watched.
And that feeling was very real. Dora saw it firsthand at Manubi University.
Really?
She was studying English literature,
Okay.
immersing herself in worlds of freedom and expression.
And all the while living under an authoritarian regime.
Exactly. But outside those books, the reality was starkly different.
I bet.
She remembers seeing police officers in her classes, taking notes on what professors were saying, what students were discussing.
Wow.
It really shut down open dialogue and critical thinking.
Oh, absolutely. A classic tactic of authoritarian regimes. They know universities can be breeding grounds for opposition.
Right.
So they use surveillance and intimidation to squash any potential challenges.
And for Dora, it wasn't just theoretical. A lot of her classmates were from poor areas outside the capital.
Okay.
They had stories of family members disappearing in the night, taken by police for speaking out.
It's easy to think oppression only targets activists or those openly challenging the regime.
Yeah.
But the truth is, authoritarianism affects everyone. You can try to keep your head down,
Right.
but you can't escape the fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that at any moment the regime could turn on you.
And then, in December of 2010, came the spark.
Oh, yeah.
Mohammed Bouazizi, a street vendor, set himself on fire
Oh,
after being humiliated and harassed by police.
I remember that.
Dora remembers seeing the videos spreading on Facebook. The smoke,
Yeah.
cries, the desperation.
It's hard to forget.
Now, Bouazizi's self-immolation wasn't the sole cause of the Tunisian revolution,
Right. Revolutions are rarely about a single event.
but it was the catalyst. It unleashed years of pent-up anger and frustration. Dora found herself drawn to the protests, this growing sense of purpose. She realized staying silent wasn't an option anymore. But this awakening also brought conflict. Her parents, terrified for her safety, begged her to stay home.
That's a tough spot to be in, that pull between safety and the need to act. It's a testament to the personal sacrifices revolutions demand, the courage it takes to stand up for what you believe in.
And Dora felt she couldn't just watch while others risked their lives for a better future.
Yeah.
She realized her parents' generation, they had lived through decades of Ben Ali's rule. They had learned to keep their heads down to accept things as they were to survive. But her generation, those who grew up with the internet, they had a different perspective.
That's so interesting. The internet, especially social media, it played such a huge role in the Arab Spring.
Absolutely.
It allowed information to spread like wildfire, bypassing state-controlled media. It gave people a way to connect, to organize, to share their grievances.
And that solidarity was clear in the protests sweeping Tunisia. Dora and her classmates started organizing on campus, and they were joined by their professors.
Wow.
These academics, who Dora had always seen as quiet intellectuals, were suddenly on the front lines, putting their words into action, inspiring their students.
These were people who had probably faced censorship and repression their whole careers. They understood the power of ideas to challenge the status quo.
The protests grew and grew, and with that came a sense of excitement, but also fear.
I can imagine.
The regime's response was brutal. Dora remembers the adrenaline, the pride, but also the terror of marching with her classmates,
Yeah.
facing down police batons and tear gas.
It's a paradox you often see in revolutions. Even in the face of danger, there's a sense of liberation.
Yeah.
of empowerment. Standing shoulder to shoulder with your fellow citizens creates this feeling of unity and purpose. It transcends the fear.
And then on January 14th, 2011, it happened. Ben Ali fled the country. Dora remembers watching the news in disbelief, tears streaming down her face. Her parents, though, they were filled with anxiety. What would happen next? Was this real freedom or just the start of more chaos?
It's that mix of euphoria and anxiety that you see so often in revolutions. The joy of toppling a dictator quickly gives way to the immense task of building a new society. The old order is gone, but what comes next? How do you manage the transition? Those were the questions Tunisia and the whole Arab world had to grapple with in the years that followed. All this was happening in Tunisia, and meanwhile, the ripples were spreading across the Arab world, especially in Egypt.
And like we talked about earlier, the internet, social media, it was absolutely key in Egypt.
Absolutely.
Lena Atala, the journalist we mentioned, she was right in the middle of that digital revolution.
Right.
Lena had been covering those growing protest movements in Egypt for years before 2011. She described life under Mubarak as like a forced slumber.
Interesting.
This stagnation, this political apathy, almost like people had given up on the idea of change.
But underneath that apathy, there was a current of discontent just waiting to break through. And she saw it online.
That's where you really see the power of the internet to challenge these authoritarian regimes.
Right.
Because in Egypt, the traditional media was totally controlled by the state.
Right.
But online, in blogs, forums, on social media, Egyptians were creating their own spaces to discuss and debate, free from Mubarak's censorship.
Exactly.
Lena was drawn to those online spaces. She recognized the potential not just to share information, but to mobilize people.
Yeah.
She saw how platforms like Facebook and Twitter were being used to organize protests, spread awareness of human rights abuses, connect with a global audience.
It's amazing to think that was still relatively early in terms of social media's impact on politics. The Arab Spring was kind of a testing ground for how these platforms could be used against authoritarian power.
Yeah.
And what happened in Egypt showed just how effective it could be.
But it wasn't all about online activism. Lena was also out in the streets documenting the unrest firsthand. She described Egypt in those days as a pressure cooker.
Oh.
Economic disparities were widening.
Yeah.
So many people were struggling to get by, while a small elite connected to the regime got richer and richer.
And all this happening against the backdrop of the global financial crisis,
Right.
which just made those inequalities even worse. Rising food and fuel prices,
Yeah.
unemployment through the roof. It was a tinderbox.
Waiting for a spark.
Exactly. And then came the spark, the revolution in Tunisia. News of Ben Ali fleeing spread like wildfire on social media. Activists in Egypt saw that and thought, hey, maybe change is possible here too. Protests started erupting, and Lena was right there documenting it all.
Her perspective as a journalist is so valuable because she wasn't just observing, she was experiencing these events firsthand,
Right.
capturing the raw emotions, the human stories that are often lost in the headlines.
Absolutely.
She spent a lot of time in Tahrir Square, which became the center of the revolution. She described the atmosphere there as electric, hope, fear, and this incredible sense of shared purpose.
Wow.
All sorts of people, students, workers, families coming together demanding Mubarak step down.
Just imagine being there in Tahrir Square. The chants, the music, the solidarity, but also the very real danger.
Right, because Mubarak's security forces were cracking down on the protesters.
It must have been so intense. The future of Egypt felt like it was hanging in the balance.
Lena believed revolutions weren't just about abstract ideas, they were embodied experiences.
Meaning?
People physically taking to the streets, reclaiming their power, demanding to be seen and heard. And that's what she saw in Tahrir Square. Egyptians from all walks of life coming together to demand a better future.
That's such a powerful way to put it. Revolutions aren't just about changing laws or policies. They're about changing the very structure of society.
Exactly, shifting those power dynamics.
Yeah.
People taking control of their own destinies. And what really struck Lena was the diversity of the protesters. It wasn't just young people or activists, it was teachers, doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, mothers, pushing strollers. This huge coalition of people from all walks of life, all united in their desire for change.
And that speaks to how widespread the dissatisfaction with Mubarak was. People were just yearning for something different.
And that's what often happens in revolutions, right? What starts as a small spark can become a massive movement as more and more people feel empowered to join in.
Absolutely. That's exactly what we saw in Egypt. The protests escalated quickly. It became a full-blown revolution with Egyptians from all walks of life demanding change.
And Lena documented it all, the hope, the fear, the violence, but also that incredible resilience of the protesters. She knew she was witnessing history.
Her work and the work of countless other journalists and citizen journalists, it played such a crucial role in shaping the world's understanding of the Egyptian Revolution.
They brought those voices and stories of the Egyptian people to the world and helped to galvanize international support for the movement.
For sure.
And then on February 11, 2011, after weeks of protest, Mubarak resigned. Jubilation, disbelief, pure elation, but also uncertainty. What would happen next? Who would fill the power vacuum? Would Egypt actually transition to a real democracy?
That question always seems to hang over revolutions. The joy of removing a dictator, it fades quickly, and then you're left with this enormous task of building a new, more just society. And as we'll see with our final story, the path from revolution to lasting change is rarely smooth. It's full of challenges, setbacks, and unforeseen consequences.
So we've seen these incredible revolutions unfold in Tunisia and Egypt, this wave of hope and change sweeping across the region. But the Arab Spring, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Each country had its own context, its own challenges. And for our last story, we're heading to Syria, where the revolution took a much darker turn.
Yeah, Syria under the Assad regime had a long and brutal history of repression.
Right, for decades, any kind of dissent was met with overwhelming force.
Absolutely.
So when the Arab Spring uprising started, there was this feeling of anticipation. Maybe this was Syria's moment. But the reality ended up being far more complicated and tragic.
Specifically.
To understand that complexity, we're going to look at the story of Ghiyas al-Jundi Idlibi. Now, unlike Dura and Lena, Ghiyas didn't grow up seeing oppression everywhere. He had a pretty comfortable life in Damascus, seemingly sheltered from the harsher realities of Assad's rule.
You have to remember that these regimes, they operate on different levels.
Right.
There's the public face, the propaganda, this image of stability and order. But then there's the hidden reality, the informants, the secret police, the prisons where anyone who speaks out is silenced.
And for Ghiyas, that hidden reality only started to come into focus after his father died in 2005.
Oh, wow.
At the funeral, his friends and relatives started sharing stories about his dad that Ghiyas had never heard before.
Really?
They talked about his father being a young activist, about his imprisonment, his years of resisting the regime. It was like Ghiyas was discovering a whole other side to his father, a side that had been kept secret for years.
I can imagine that was a lot to process for him.
Absolutely. It was a turning point for Ghiyas. He started questioning everything he thought he knew about his father, his family, his country.
It makes sense.
He dug into the past, looking at old articles, documents, blogs, trying to piece together this hidden history of Syria's opposition movement.
And as he learned more about that history, he started to see the realities of life outside his privileged bubble in Damascus.
Exactly. He began to understand the depth of the suffering, the oppression that so many Syrians were living under. The fear, the disappearances, the brutal crackdowns.
In the years leading up to 2011, he saw that discontent growing, fueled by economic hardship and widespread corruption.
The gap between the rich and the poor was widening.
Right. And there was this feeling that the regime was completely out of touch with the needs of ordinary Syrians.
It's a pattern we see in a lot of countries that have revolutions.
Yeah, economic inequality combined with political oppression, it creates this volatile situation, ready to explode.
And when news of the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt reached Syria, it was like a match being struck.
A lot of young Syrians felt that sense of hope, like maybe change was finally possible.
Ghiyas included.
But the Syrian regime, under Bashar al-Assad, they responded to those early protests with just brutal force.
Unlike in Tunisia and Egypt, there was no negotiation, no peaceful transfer of power. Assad was going to hold on to power no matter what.
He inherited a regime that was built on violence and repression. His father, Hafez al-Assad, had ruled Syria with an iron fist for decades, crushing any opposition, creating a culture of fear within the security services.
So when faced with the Arab Spring, Bashar al-Assad, he just resorted to what he knew, violence and intimidation.
Makes sense.
Ghiyas saw the impact of that violence firsthand. He was running a pizza franchise at the time, trying to build a life for himself. But as the crackdown got worse, he couldn't ignore what was happening.
It must have been terrifying.
One of his employees even asked him if he wanted to buy a gun.
Wow, that speaks volumes about how bad things were getting.
Ghiyas couldn't just stand by and watch. He started supporting the activists in his city, giving them flour from his warehouse to help feed the protesters.
Such a small act of defiance, but in that context, it was huge.
And it had serious consequences for Ghiyas. He was arrested by the Air Force intelligence, detained, interrogated, tortured.
It's hard to even imagine what he went through.
He was released after a few days, but the experience left him shaken, and even more determined to resist.
His story gives you a glimpse into how brutal the Syrian regime was, the lengths they were willing to go to silence anyone who disagreed with them, imprisonment, torture, disappearance, even death.
And Giesa was arrested 2 more times after that.
Oh, gosh.
After the third time, he knew he couldn't stay in Syria. He fled to Lebanon with his younger brother, fearing for their lives.
It's heartbreaking to think about all the Syrians who were forced to make that choice.
To leave everything they knew behind.
The conflict in Syria, it started as a peaceful uprising, but it quickly spiraled into this brutal civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions displaced.
It's been 10 years, and Gaius is still in exile, unable to go home. He describes Syria as a lost country, a place that's unrecognizable from the one he knew. The revolution that started with so much hope, it turned into a nightmare, a tragedy on an unimaginable scale.
It's a stark reminder that revolutions, they can be incredibly fragile. They can easily be derailed by violence and extremism, and the consequences can be devastating.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Arab Spring, what can we learn from these 3 stories from Dora, Lena, and Gaius? What does it tell us about revolutions, about the possibilities and the dangers of demanding change?
I think the Arab Spring shows us that revolutions are rarely simple. They're messy, unpredictable, and often come at a huge cost.
But they also show us the power of the human spirit.
Yeah, that desire for freedom and dignity, it can topple dictators and inspire generations to fight for a better world.
And maybe the most important lesson is that the desire for change, it's not limited to any one place or time. It's in all of us. It's up to each of us to think about what true freedom means in our own societies and what we're willing to do to make sure everyone has that freedom.